They said I had nothing left. That was the line they whispered in the hallway before the hearing, thinking I couldn't hear through the thin wooden door. She has nothing left. She doesn't even understand what she's fighting for. I remember those exact words because they didn't sting the way they expected. They floated toward me like dust motes in morning light, faint and absurd. Nothing left? I had my name and I had my memory, and that was enough to burn through every false kindness they ever offered me. My name, written in my husband's hand on the trust, carved on the brass plate of the office we built together, stitched on the inside of the coat he bought me the winter before he died, was not something they could erase with one signature. I was 79, walking slowly but upright, with a steady mind that had outlived every prediction. They said I was confused, fragile, sentimental. The judge would later use a different word, competent. When people tell you you have nothing left, what they really mean is that you've stopped being useful to them. I learned that the day after my husband's funeral. The house still smelled of lilies and disinfectant, the coffee pot still warm from visitors who didn't know what to say, and my eldest, Robert, was already talking about streamlining the estate. He spoke in the soft managerial tone he used with employees, though I had never worked for him. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, sat beside him, one manicured hand resting on his sleeve, her eyes kind but calculating. "You shouldn't have to worry about all this, Mom," she said. "Let us take care of it." It was phrased like an act of mercy. Grief makes you pliable. I nodded, half listening, thinking only of the way my husband's shoes still sat by the door. They took the house keys that afternoon, said they'd make copies so the realtor could have access if needed. By evening, I realized they hadn't returned them. I moved through that week like a ghost, answering condolence calls, pretending to eat, folding and unfolding the corner of the last letter my husband wrote me before surgery, the one that ended with, "You've always been the keeper of our home." I didn't yet understand what those words would come to mean. When the lawyer called about updating the papers, Robert insisted on joining the call. He told me it was standard procedure, that widows often misunderstood the jargon. He smiled the way he used to when he wanted money for something unnecessary. It's strange how motherhood trains you to hear the child still buried inside the man, even when his voice has hardened. I could still hear it in him, but I also heard something else. Ownership. He spoke about assets, about liquidity, about streamlining, as if the decades of work, saving, and building were an inconvenient spreadsheet he could clean with a keystroke. The lawyer, a man named Connors, addressed me as Mrs. Harlow and asked perfunctory questions. Most of the talking came from Robert. I signed what they handed me. I told myself it was temporary paperwork, power of attorney for convenience, signatures to simplify probate. I wanted to believe they were protecting me. A widow's mind looks for protection, the way a child looks for light in the dark. But even then, there was a chill behind their warmth. It was a month later, at the bank, that I first felt the ground tilt. I went to withdraw money for the gardener and was told politely that the account had been consolidated, such a clean word for confiscated. I called Robert. He said, "Don't worry, Mom. We've merged everything into a family trust. It's safer this way." The way he said safer made it sound like I was a danger to myself. I told him I wanted to see the papers. He promised to bring them by soon. Soon never came. Instead came packages of pre-cooked meals, wellness pamphlets, and phone calls that ended with, "You really shouldn't be handling all this stress at your age." I started keeping a notebook. Every call, every date, every lie. The loneliness was thick but clean. I'd lost friends to death and distance, and the house, our house, grew quieter each day. I thought of moving closer to the sea, where my husband and I once planned to retire, but Robert said it wasn't practical. "You'd be isolated, Mom. Let us find something comfortable for you." Comfort, I learned, was their word for control. Within months, I was in an assisted living community, a beige corridor lined with identical paintings of flowers no one could name. They called it Maple Hollow, as if the name itself could convince us we were living under trees instead of fluorescent lights. My room was small but tidy, and I told myself I didn't mind. But when you've spent a lifetime building a home where every object holds memory, a tidy room is just another kind of emptiness. Each Thursday they visited, always together, always smiling. Melissa brought lavender lotion. Robert adjusted the thermostat. Both spoke in that bright managerial tone people use when they've decided what's best for you. "Mom, you're so lucky to have a place like this," they'd say. "Most people your age can't afford it." I would smile and nod, because what else could I do? Arguing would only confirm their story, that I was difficult, emotional, unstable. But inside, something small and stubborn began to press against the walls of my chest, the way a sprout pushes through concrete. One afternoon, the nurse wheeled me down to the community room for estate planning advice, a seminar for seniors. The speaker was a young woman in a sharp navy suit, all confidence and efficiency. She said something that caught me. "Always keep a copy of every legal document that bears your signature. Photocopy it. Store it somewhere only you can access. That paper is your voice when others stop listening." Her words landed like a spark in dry grass. That night, I asked the night attendant to help me access my safety deposit box. She said she couldn't authorize it without family consent. I waited until shift change, then asked again. The morning nurse, less cautious, simply handed me the form to sign. 2 days later, I was at the bank, sitting in a cold cubicle, the steel box on the table before me. Inside were the things that survived the slow erasure: the marriage certificate, the deed to our first home, my husband's will, and, folded between insurance statements, a file labeled Trust Agreement 2009. My hands trembled as I opened it. Line by line, I saw my name. Not Robert's, not Melissa's, mine. Primary trustee, Martha Harlow, sole executor, beneficiary in perpetuity. My husband had done what he'd never had time to tell me. He'd left everything in my name. I sat there, staring at those sentences until they blurred into the steel of the table. That discovery should have felt like triumph, but it didn't. It felt like grief all over again, because the man who had trusted me completely was gone, and the people I had raised now treated me like a misfiled document. I left the bank with the file tucked inside my coat. For the first time in months, I walked home without stopping to rest. The air was cold and real against my face. I passed a bakery, the smell of yeast and sugar pulling memories from somewhere deep, our first apartment, the mornings when we shared one roll and laughed about being poor. We were never poor in anything that mattered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spread the papers across the narrow bed, reading every clause, tracing my husband's initials where he had signed beside mine. The legal language was dense, but one sentence was clear. In the event of my death, all decisions, properties, and holdings shall remain under the full discretion of my wife, Martha E. Harlow. That was the moment I began to breathe differently, not faster, not louder, just differently, like air was returning to lungs that had been holding their breath too long. The next morning, when Robert called to remind me of my doctor's evaluation, I told him I wouldn't be available. He hesitated. "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean I have appointments of my own." He laughed politely, like one humors a child pretending to be busy. He didn't know I'd already called a lawyer, not a family friend, but a woman recommended by the young lecturer, the kind of woman who didn't smile unnecessarily. When I told her what happened, she listened without interrupting. When I showed her the trust, she looked at me, then said, "Mrs. Harlow, do you understand what this means?" I said yes. I understood perfectly. So when I sat in that courtroom months later, hands folded in my lap, listening to my own son's lawyer argue that I was incapable of managing my affairs, I wasn't afraid. The walls were tall, the air smelled of paper and polish, and the people who shared my blood sat 3 rows away, whispering, confident that I was already defeated. That was when I heard them. She has nothing left. But they were wrong. The judge began to read, his voice steady and deliberate, and with every page he said my name, over and over, like a bell reclaiming its sound. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight of everything that was still mine, memory, dignity, truth, and it was enough to begin again. The catalyst began quietly, the way storms sometimes begin as stillness. I had returned from the bank that day with the file hidden under my coat, the edges of the envelope warm from my hands, my pulse steady but high. And I remember thinking that truth has its own temperature. It burns, but not like fire, more like light, after too much darkness. The next morning, I placed the folder on the small table in my room at Maple Hollow and stared at it for a long time, wondering if I should even open it again. There is a strange kind of fear that comes with suddenly realizing you are not powerless. Power demands action, and I had grown so used to silence that the thought of speaking, of claiming anything, felt almost dangerous. I decided to wait a day, tell no one, and listen instead. You can learn everything about a person by listening when they think you're deaf. That afternoon, Robert arrived alone. It was unusual. He almost always brought Melissa as reinforcement. He looked restless, carrying a leather briefcase that was far too formal for a visit to a retirement facility. He didn't hug me. He rarely did anymore, as if proximity might taint him with age. He sat across from me, crossed one leg over the other, and cleared his throat. "Mom, we need to finalize some things regarding the estate," he began, and his tone carried that rehearsed calm of someone who believes they are managing a crisis. I asked which things, pretending ignorance, and he opened the briefcase, producing a thin stack of documents clipped together. The first page bore the heading, Transfer of Trustee Responsibilities. He slid it toward me with a pen. "This just formalizes what we discussed. Melissa and I will handle everything moving forward. It's for your peace of mind." I didn't reach for it. Instead, I asked him to explain each clause. He seemed surprised, maybe even irritated. "It's just legal wording, Mom. You don't need to trouble yourself." His voice softened the way it did when he spoke to clients he considered slow. He pointed at a signature line and said, "Right here, and we can get this over with." I looked at my son, the same boy who once built birdhouses in the backyard, who scraped his knees on the driveway and came running to me crying, and realized I didn't, recognized the man he had become. The distance wasn't sudden. It had been growing like mold, quiet and unnoticed until it took over everything. I told him I wanted to think about it. His jaw tightened. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be." He reached for my hand and pressed the pen into it. His grip was firm, the way one might hold an object, not a person. "You've done so much already." Let us carry the weight now. I looked at his fingers, my husband's fingers, inherited, and thought how strange it was that they could carry both love and manipulation in the same gesture. I placed the pen on the table and said, as evenly as I could, I've been thinking about weight lately, Robert, and I don't think it's mine to give away. He blinked, uncertain how to interpret that. He smiled then, tight and professional, and said, Of course, take your time, but don't delay too long. These things get complicated. He gathered the papers, slipping them neatly into the briefcase, unaware that I had already read the originals the night before in my husband's handwriting. When he left, he kissed my cheek out of habit. His cologne was sharp and unfamiliar. I waited until the sound of his car faded from the parking lot before I exhaled. That night, I hid the trust file inside the lining of my suitcase. I didn't sleep, but I wasn't afraid either. I felt something colder, steadier, a resolve that hummed beneath the surface like a low electric current. 2 days later, the manager of Maple Hollow called me to the office. She was a small, nervous woman who spoke in apologies. She said my son had requested to review my financial arrangements to ensure my care could continue. The word review struck me as both harmless and poisonous. I told her politely that my affairs were in order and that any documents were to remain private. She hesitated, wringing her hands. Mrs. Harlow, he's listed as your financial guardian. I corrected her gently. No, he isn't. I asked her to bring the form that said otherwise. She checked her files, frowned, and found nothing. The color drained from her face. She stammered something about system errors. I thanked her and went back to my room, each step lighter than the last. That was when I knew the betrayal wasn't coming. It had already happened. The only thing left was to uncover the extent of it. I called the lawyer I'd met, the woman with the clear eyes and the careful voice. Her name was Evelyn Finch. I told her everything. She listened quietly, then said, Mrs. Harlow, I need you to bring me the documents tomorrow. Don't tell anyone you're coming. Her tone was gentle but firm, like a nurse speaking before a painful procedure. The next morning, I took a taxi into town. I wore my husband's old wool coat, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar, and carried the file inside a canvas grocery bag. I walked into her office and placed the papers on her desk. She read quickly but thoroughly, tracing each line with her fingertip, occasionally murmuring something under her breath. When she looked up, her expression was different, sharper, more alert. You have full authority, Mrs. Harlow. Every clause names you. Your son has been managing funds he doesn't legally control. I felt neither joy nor rage, only a deep, weary clarity. Evelyn asked if I wanted to pursue legal action. I said I wanted truth first, then justice. She nodded and began making copies, her movements precise. When she finished, she handed me a smaller folder and said, Keep this on you. This is your protection. The paper was thin, but it felt heavier than anything I'd held in years. That evening, back at Maple Hollow, I found my room unlocked. My drawers had been disturbed. Small things, trivial things, were out of place. My notebook was missing. I asked the nurse about it, and she said Robert had stopped by, just to pick up a few of your papers. She thought he had my permission. I thanked her without expression and went to the window. Outside, the parking lot lights glowed weakly in the mist. I imagined him driving away, that confident tilt of his head, believing I was too tired to notice what he'd done. But I had already made copies. Every word of the trust was now duplicated and stored with Evelyn. The next time he tried to erase me, he'd find the ink too permanent. The catalyst wasn't the discovery of the betrayal itself. It was the realization that I had participated in it by remaining quiet for so long. Silence had been my way of loving him, of loving all of them. I thought endurance was grace, but endurance without recognition becomes complicity. That night, I packed a small bag, a change of clothes, the folder from Evelyn, my husband's photo, and a book of poems he used to read aloud on rainy evenings. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the small, sterile room that was supposed to be my sanctuary. It looked less like safety and more like storage. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation. I wrote a note to the manager, simple and polite. Thank you for your kindness. I won't be returning. At dawn, I walked out of Maple Hollow. No one stopped me. The sky was the pale gray of unripe fruit. I took the first bus into the city, the folder pressed against my chest under my coat. I watched the landscape slide by, the trimmed lawns, the gas stations, the indifferent rhythm of morning commuters. Somewhere between the suburbs and downtown, I felt a strange calm. Betrayal had stripped away illusion, and what remained was not emptiness, but space, room enough for truth to stand. I met Evelyn at her office again that afternoon. She already had the papers prepared for filing. I signed them without hesitation. Each stroke of the pen felt like reclaiming oxygen. She looked at me when we were done and said, "This will change everything. They won't expect you to fight." I told her that was the point. Outside, the rain began to fall, slow, deliberate drops that made the pavement glisten. I lifted my face to it for a moment before walking toward the bus stop. The air was cold, and the city smelled of wet asphalt and courage. That was the day the betrayal became official. Not because of what Robert had done, but because of what I finally decided to undo. The woman who entered Maple Hollow months before, small and apologetic, had been erased piece by piece. The woman who stepped out that morning carried the weight of her own name like a verdict and knew exactly what she was fighting for. The weeks that followed moved like water, slow at the surface, fierce underneath. I was still living at Maple Hollow, though by then the walls had started to whisper. Every kindness from the staff felt rehearsed, and every phone call from my son arrived wrapped in guilt. He began calling twice a day now, not to ask how I was, but to remind me of how much he was managing for me. "You have no idea how complicated all this is, Mom. I've been doing damage control for months." He spoke like a man drowning in paperwork, though the only papers drowning him were the ones that proved the money was mine. Each conversation left a residue, a sticky mix of exhaustion and resolve. I learned to speak less, to listen for the fear beneath his control. There is always fear in control. It's the only thing that keeps it alive. Evelyn had begun the legal process quietly, filing notices, freezing accounts, tracing transfers. She said it would take time, that truth in court always walks slower than lies. I visited her office weekly under the pretext of doctor's appointments. Each time she handed me a new set of copies, neatly stapled, labeled, and explained in simple language. She treated me not like a fragile widow, but like a client with agency, which is rarer than anyone admits. I started reading those papers at night, sitting by the window of my room at Maple Hollow, the faint hum of fluorescent light above me. The words, once foreign and cold, began to make sense. Revocable trust, beneficiary in perpetuity, breach of fiduciary duty. I repeated them quietly, the way one learns a prayer. They became part of my new vocabulary of survival. The first sign that Robert suspected something came in the form of flowers, white lilies, delivered without a note. I knew what they meant. He used to send them to Melissa after arguments, his peace offering. But these were not peace. They were warning. That evening he called, voice soft, too soft. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we simplify everything. You've been through so much, and all this legal noise can't be good for you. Let's just make things easier." I asked him easier for whom. He laughed lightly, like it was a joke. For everyone, of course. That word, everyone, had become his shield. He wielded it like morality, as if selfishness could disguise itself as family concern. I told him I needed rest and ended the call. After that, the phone began ringing at odd hours. Sometimes it was Melissa, sometimes his lawyer. Once a social worker from the county called to check in on me. Her voice carried that manufactured concern of someone reading from a script. She asked if I felt safe, if I had access to my medications, if I was comfortable with my current living situation. I asked who had filed the inquiry. She hesitated, then said, "A family member expressed concern about your mental clarity." I laughed, not out of amusement, but disbelief. My own son had preemptively built the foundation for a case that would declare me unfit to manage what I owned. They were turning me into a ghost while I was still alive. Evelyn wasn't surprised. "This is how they do it," she said, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "When control slips, they build a narrative that you're losing touch with reality. It's not personal. It's procedural." I told her it felt deeply personal. She gave a small smile. "That means you're still human. Keep records of everything, calls, visits, even flowers. Silence is their camouflage. Documentation will be yours." I took her advice. Every time the phone rang, I wrote down the date, the time, the tone of their voices. I began to understand that the weapon they feared most was not anger, it was clarity. Life at Maple Hollow grew heavier. The staff began treating me differently, not cruelly, but with that cautious politeness reserved for people who might explode. The new administrator, a man named Greg, started stopping by just to check in. He'd ask if I was taking my medication, if I had enough to occupy my days. His eyes lingered on my desk, where papers were neatly stacked. One afternoon he said, "You know, Mrs. Harlow, some residents find legal matters distressing. Maybe it's best to let your son handle those details." I smiled and told him that distress sharpens the mind. He didn't laugh. A week later, I found that my outgoing mail had been opened and resealed. I didn't report it. Instead, I began mailing everything directly from Evelyn's office. It's strange how quickly confinement can disguise itself as care. Meals appeared at my door before I asked. My laundry was done without permission. The staff began referring to me in the third person when I was in the room. "She's been restless lately," they would say. "She's anxious about paperwork." The language of diminishment seeps in like humidity. It dampens the air until you start gasping without realizing it. So I started walking, circling the garden behind the facility every morning, counting steps, memorizing the cracks in the pavement, the rhythm of my own breathing. Each lap was a reminder that I still occupied space, that I was still visible to the sky, if not to them. One afternoon, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from my granddaughter, Emily, written in the round handwriting of someone who still believes letters mean connection. She said she missed me, that her father didn't talk about me much anymore, and that Melissa had cried last week when someone mentioned my name. She ended with, "I hope you're not mad at us. Dad says you're confused, but I know you're just sad." I read it 3 times, tracing the indentation of her words with my fingertip. Children always see the truth first. It's adults who learn how to pretend blindness. I wrote back that I wasn't mad, just disappointed that truth frightened grown-ups so easily. I mailed the letter from the post office downtown, not the facility's desk. It felt like an act of rebellion. The legal process dragged on. There were filings, responses, counterclaims. Evelyn kept me informed, never sugarcoating. "They'll try to wear you down," she said. "They'll hope exhaustion does what persuasion couldn't." I told her I'd been tired before. Fatigue was an old friend. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that belongs to women who have fought too many quiet wars. Then came the visitation hearing. Robert had filed for limited guardianship on the basis of diminished capacity. Evelyn prepared me meticulously. She told me to stay calm, answer directly, never react to provocations. I wore a navy dress that still fit, ironed by my own hand. When I entered the courtroom, Robert and Melissa were already there, their lawyer beside them, sleek and smiling. They didn't look at me. That was fine. I wasn't there for their eyes. I was there for the record. The judge, a woman in her 50s, with a kind face and a weary patience, asked questions. Evelyn presented the trust. My husband's signature gleamed under the courtroom lights, his handwriting steady as ever. When the judge read the clauses aloud, Robert's jaw twitched. Melissa shifted in her seat. The judge looked at me and said, "Mrs. Harlow, do you understand these terms?" I met her gaze. "Perfectly," I said. The room fell silent, and for the first time Robert looked afraid, not of losing money but of being seen. The petition was denied, but the damage was done. They left the courthouse without speaking to me. I stood on the steps, the afternoon sun harsh on my face, and felt something close to peace. Not victory, peace. Because there is a difference between winning and being believed. One restores property, the other restores personhood. I walked to a nearby cafe and ordered tea. The young waitress smiled when she brought it, unaware that she was serving a woman who had just clawed back her own name from oblivion. I drank slowly, tasting the metal of the cup and the sweetness of release. After that day, the visits stopped. The calls thinned. Silence, which had once been my punishment, became my sanctuary. I began to fill the quiet with purpose. I started writing letters to myself, small affirmations folded into the pages of books. You are still the keeper of the house. They cannot erase ink already dry. Evelyn encouraged me to take a short trip, said I needed distance. I told her I wasn't running. I was reclaiming pace. There's a difference. She understood. Back at Maple Hollow, I began sorting through my things. The staff noticed, of course. They watched as I folded clothes, as I stacked books, as I taped boxes. One evening, Greg knocked on my door. "Planning a move?" he asked, smiling too wide. "Just organizing," I said. He nodded, pretending to believe me. I had already found a small apartment in town, a place with wide windows and a view of the river. Evelyn had helped arrange it quietly, under my own signature. My name was on the lease, in bold letters. Seeing it there felt like touching the surface of something solid after months of drifting. The night before I left, I stood in the hallway of Maple Hollow, looking at the framed photographs of residents who had passed. Their faces were gentle, their stories forgotten. I whispered a quiet promise to them. You were more than this place allowed you to be. Then I turned off the light in my room, picked up my suitcase, and closed the door without looking back. The lock clicked softly, final but not sad. The first escalation wasn't a scene of shouting or revelation. It was a slow, deliberate rising of self. Betrayal had cracked something open, and from that fracture grew direction. I had stopped waiting for permission to exist. The next morning, as the taxi pulled away, I watched Maple Hollow reseed in the mirror, its beige walls shrinking until they became nothing but a rumor. The city ahead shimmered with possibility, and for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't just surviving their cruelty. I was dismantling it, one quiet decision at a time. The first morning in my new apartment felt like waking up inside my own skin again. The air was different, unfiltered, unsupervised, carrying the faint smell of the river that curved through the city 2 streets away. It was small, 1 bedroom and a kitchen that fit into a corner, but it was mine in a way nothing had been for a long time. I touched the walls the way people touch a newborn, careful not to disturb their fragile newness. The windows were large enough to let the light crawl across the floor, like a guest that never needed to be invited. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, as though each object needed to remember its purpose. My husband's photograph went on the shelf above the table. The folder from Evelyn went into a drawer beside the bed. And the teacup with the tiny crack, the one I'd brought from the old house, stood on the counter like a relic of another faith. For the first week, I did nothing but walk. The city was unfamiliar, but walking is an old language. My knees protested, but my heart thanked them for remembering. I passed bakeries that smelled of yeast and memory, thrift shops with fading signage, children dragging backpacks bigger than their bodies. I would stop at a bench near the bridge, watching the water churn beneath it, the surface never still, never certain. I began to understand that peace doesn't always look like calm. Sometimes it looks like motion that no longer needs an audience. Evelyn called to check on me. She said the next hearing was set for early spring. "You'll need to testify this time," she warned. "They'll try to frame you as erratic. They'll mention the move, the independence, the secrecy. You'll need to show them that what they call confusion is just courage." I told her I'd been practicing. Every day, I read sections of the trust aloud, learning their cadence, memorizing the sentences that had once felt foreign. Each clause became a verse, and by the end of the week, I could recite them from memory. Sometimes I whispered them while boiling water for tea. In the event of my husband's death, all holdings and decisions shall remain under the full discretion of his wife, Martha E. Harlow. It became a mantra, not of possession, but of identity. I had spent years being introduced as someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's burden. Now, at last, I was a legal fact in my own right. The neighbors were curious. The woman across the hall, a retired librarian named June, knocked one evening, holding a pie she said was an apology for the smell of my cat. We ended up talking for hours. She told me she'd lost her husband 15 years ago and had never remarried because, in her words, one good conversation lasts longer than 10 polite marriages. I liked her immediately. She had that rare ability to listen without hunger, without trying to fix or advise. When I told her I'd just left an assisted facility, she raised an eyebrow. "Voluntarily?" she asked. "Voluntarily," I said. She nodded as if I'd just confessed to a glorious crime. We began sharing breakfast on Sundays, sitting by her window that overlooked a half-forgotten park. She lent me books, mostly biographies of women who had outlived their usefulness and then discovered their power. It was through June that I learned about a community center nearby offering night classes for seniors, painting, computer literacy, and, oddly enough, introductory law. I signed up for the law class the next day. The instructor was a young man barely 30, kind enough not to speak slowly, but still careful with his words. The other students were women like me, all carrying invisible bruises, widows, divorcees, sisters who'd been erased from family wills. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk and hand sanitizer, and the fluorescent lights flickered in sympathy with our hesitation. But as the lessons went on, the words stopped being weapons of other people's making and started becoming tools of our own. We learned about clauses, about how language can be both a cage and a key. The instructor once said, "The law was written by men who assumed women would never read it closely enough to use it." I smiled at that. We were proving them wrong, sentence by sentence. Every evening after class, I'd walk home with my notes pressed to my chest like a diary. I would stop by the small cafe under my building, where the barista, a young woman with tired eyes and a gentle voice, would greet me with, "The usual, Miss Martha." She never called me ma'am, never assumed fragility. She treated me like a person in motion. Sometimes I stayed until closing, listening to the low hum of other people's lives, realizing how strange and beautiful it felt to exist without being monitored. I had stopped checking my phone weeks ago. Robert's number still appeared on the screen occasionally, but I didn't answer. I no longer needed to hear him call me Mom in that patronizing tone that stripped the word of all tenderness. The more I learned, the more I began to see the shape of their manipulation. They hadn't just taken my money, they had rewritten my narrative. The false guardianship papers, the phone calls to the social worker, the controlled visits, all of it had been a campaign of erasure dressed as care. Understanding this didn't make me angry. It made me meticulous. I began gathering every document Evelyn might need: receipts, bank statements, letters, even old emails I had printed years ago. I bought a cheap filing cabinet and labeled everything in careful handwriting. My handwriting had started to tremble slightly, but the lines remained legible, steady enough to testify that I still had command over myself. Winter deepened. Snow fell one night in silence, layering the city in temporary purity. I stood by the window, watching the world soften under it. There was something comforting about how even the ugliest streets could look innocent again, if only for a night. I thought of my husband, of his laugh, of the way he used to rest his hand on mine at the kitchen table when bills piled too high. "We'll figure it out," he'd say, always in plural, always in we. The trust, I realized, wasn't just about money. It was his last attempt to keep that we alive, even when I was left alone to pronounce it. Around that time, Evelyn called again. She said Robert's lawyer had reached out. They wanted mediation, claiming that prolonged litigation would tear the family apart. I told her the family had been torn long before the first filing. Still, I agreed to the meeting, partly out of curiosity, partly to look him in the eyes and see if there was anything left of the boy I'd raised. The mediation took place in a sterile office with too much glass and not enough warmth. Robert arrived with Melissa, both dressed in matching tones of apology. He began with practiced contrition. "Mom, this has all gotten out of hand. We just want what's best for you." I let him speak. I let him rehearse his sincerity. When he finished, I placed a copy of the trust on the table and said quietly, "You've mistaken inheritance for entitlement. One is earned by life, the other stolen by assumption." Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but the mediator raised her hand. The silence that followed was long enough to contain every unspoken thing between us. When we left the building, he didn't look back. I didn't expect him to. That night I walked to the river. The air was brittle, sharp enough to sting my lungs, but I welcomed it. I leaned on the railing and watched the water move under the bridge lights, dark, relentless, untamed. It struck me that the river didn't need to win or lose against the banks. It only needed to keep moving. I realized I was like that now. I no longer needed revenge or reconciliation. I just needed motion, forward and free. In February, The community center hosted an exhibit of the students' work. June convinced me to display something even though I wasn't an artist. I brought a simple collage I'd made in class, copies of legal pages cut into strips, layered over an old photograph of my house, and in the corner, in my husband's handwriting, the words, "Martha decides." People stopped to look at it longer than I expected. One woman, younger than my son, said softly, "It's about freedom, isn't it?" I nodded, but didn't explain. Some truths don't need translation. That was the midpoint of my story, the quiet shift where fear stopped dictating my next step. I still had court ahead, still had memories that hurt when touched, but something fundamental had changed. I was no longer the woman waiting to be rescued or proven sane. I was the woman who knew that sanity is not granted by others. It's claimed by those who refuse to disappear. When I returned home that night, the apartment felt warmer, almost breathing with me. I made tea, sat by the window, and for the first time since my husband's death, whispered aloud into the empty room, "We figured it out." The pronoun no longer needed him to exist. It was mine now, strong and singular, and it was enough. It began with a letter that arrived without warning, slipped under my door in the early hours of a rain-heavy morning. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, the kind that only lawyers still used. My name, Mrs. Martha E. Harlow, was written in a precise, practiced hand, not printed, as though the sender believed handwriting would soften what it carried. I held it for a long moment before opening it, my thumb tracing the seal like a pulse. Inside, several pages, dense with clauses, numbered paragraphs, and footnotes, proposed a settlement. My son and his attorney offered a generous monthly allowance for comfort and care in exchange for my resignation as trustee and executor. The tone was polished, almost gentle, as if the betrayal were now a polite business arrangement. I read it twice, once as a mother, once as a woman who had finally learned to see herself in legal terms. As a mother, I wanted to weep. As a woman, I almost smiled. Their desperation had grown careful, and that meant they were afraid. I placed the letter on the table beside the teacup, poured myself coffee instead, and read it again under the daylight that seeped through the curtains. Each sentence was an echo of the same old arrogance dressed in velvet. "We only want what's best for you. Let us take the burden off your shoulders. Accept our support with grace." Grace, such a weaponized word. For decades, they had measured my love by my ability to forgive, to remain calm while being erased. I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and wrote one line on its back in my slow, looping script: "No settlement. The burden is mine to keep." Then I walked to the mailbox on the corner and sent it to Evelyn. She called me that afternoon, her voice steady but tinged with the restrained excitement of a woman who smelled victory before it was safe to name it. "They're panicking," she said. "They know the documents are solid, and they know public exposure will tarnish them more than it will hurt you." I asked her what came next. "Now," she said, "we let them show their true faces." They didn't make us wait long. A week later, I was sitting by the window, reading a thin volume of poetry, when the knock came. 2 uniformed officers stood in the hallway, polite but impersonal. They had a court order for a wellness check requested by my family. One of them, a younger man with kind eyes, asked to step inside. I invited them in calmly, offered tea even. They glanced around the apartment, neat, quiet, alive, and took notes on their clipboard. "You seem fine to me, ma'am," one said awkwardly. I told him I had been fine for quite some time. It was others who had trouble adjusting. When they left, I closed the door gently, then stood still for a long moment, listening to the rain against the glass. They were trying to build a narrative, one inspection at a time. A woman who lived alone, who studied law for no apparent reason, who refused her children's care. It was an easy story to sell if no one listened too closely. I called Evelyn. She wasn't surprised. "They're creating a record," she said. "Every visit, every note, every whisper will become evidence of your supposed fragility." I asked what we could do. "We answer with documentation," she said, "and you keep living. Nothing dismantles a lie faster than continuity." Her advice became my discipline. Each morning I kept my routines as if they were legal testimony: walking at 9, class at 6, tea at 8. Stability itself became my rebellion, but beneath that calm, the tension tightened like wire. Letters arrived weekly now, formal, condescending, and increasingly frantic. They called me beloved mother in one sentence and non-compliant trustee in the next. Melissa's handwriting appeared on one envelope, smaller, more human. Her note was almost tender. "Please, Martha, think of the family. The lawyers are tearing us apart. We can't sleep knowing you're alone like this. Alone like this." I wanted to laugh. They had spent years ensuring my solitude. Now they pretended to mourn it. I didn't reply. The silence between us had grown into something sacred, a space that no apology could safely cross. Then, one afternoon, while leaving the community center, I saw Robert across the street. He was standing beside a sleek black car, coat collar turned up, eyes fixed on me. The traffic light blinked red between us, and for a second it felt like time had folded. I could see both the boy he was, the one who used to wave at me from the soccer field, and the man who now measured affection in market value. He didn't call out, just lifted a hand as though in greeting, but his expression wasn't warm. It was evaluative, the look of a man assessing property damage. I turned away and kept walking, my heart steady, not racing. I had already lost him. What stood there was only the echo of a son. That night I wrote in my journal, "Control wears the mask of concern until the moment you stop obeying." I underlined it twice. Writing had become my form of witness. Each word was a safeguard against their version of events. Evelyn once told me, "The most dangerous thing about injustice is how normal it sounds when spoken calmly." I decided never to let calmness disarm truth again. A few days later, I received another letter, not from the family this time, but from the court. The next hearing date had been confirmed. I would testify, not as a victim, but as the legal executor defending her rightful role. Evelyn prepared me for what they would say, that I was emotionally unstable, that grief had impaired my judgment, that I was being manipulated by an ambitious attorney. She told me to let them speak, to let the weight of their words reveal their cruelty. "When the time comes," she said, "just tell your story plainly. Dignity, Mrs. Harlow, is not silence, it's precision." I spent the days leading up to the hearing in quiet rehearsal. I practiced speaking without anger, breathing between sentences, holding my ground not through volume, but through clarity. I ironed my dress, polished my husband's wedding ring that I still wore, and reread the trust once more before bed, tracing his signature with my fingertip as if it were a map home. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom felt colder than before. Robert and Melissa sat together, their lawyer whispering between them. They looked tired, not from guilt, but from the strain of maintaining a story they no longer believed. When the judge entered, we stood. The session began with their side presenting evidence of my decline. Letters from doctors I'd never met. testimonies from staff at Maple Hollow claiming I'd been disoriented and withdrawn. Listening to it was like attending my own funeral. Each phrase another shovel of dirt. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the smooth edge of my ring against my thumb. When it was Evelyn's turn, she rose calmly, presented the documents, and read aloud the clauses in my husband's handwriting. The judge nodded occasionally, her expression unreadable. Then Evelyn called me to the stand. My knees trembled slightly as I stood, but not from fear. It was the tremor of a body carrying the weight of its own endurance. The oath felt unnecessary. I had been telling the truth for months. Evelyn began gently, asking me to describe the events after my husband's death. I spoke slowly, not as a defense, but as an act of remembrance. I told them about the day Robert took the keys, the phone calls, the isolation, the flowers that smelled like warning. I told them how the world grows small when everyone insists they know what's best for you. I didn't raise my voice. The courtroom grew still, the air thick with something unspoken. When Evelyn handed me the copy of the trust, I held it up. This, I said, isn't about money. It's about memory. Every signature here is a sentence he wrote to keep me whole. Robert's lawyer objected, called my statement performative. The judge overruled him. Then she asked one question that caught me off guard. Mrs. Harlow, what do you hope to achieve with this case? I paused. The truth rose easily, without rehearsal. To remind my children, I said, that I am not the remainder of a life. They are the result of one. The judge looked at me for a long moment, then nodded as if to herself. When the session ended, no verdict was given. That would come later. But as I stepped down from the stand, something irreversible had already occurred. The courtroom that once echoed with their authority now carried my voice, and they couldn't unhear it. Outside, the sunlight hit me square in the face. I hadn't realized how long I'd been breathing shallowly until that moment. Evelyn touched my arm gently and said, "You changed the temperature in that room." The days that followed were quieter, but charged. The newspapers printed a small piece about the case, a mere column on page 6, but the headline struck me like poetry. Elderly widow challenges family over hidden trust. The phrasing reduced my life to 8 words, yet it carried the pulse of something larger. People in my building began leaving small notes on my door. Stay strong. You're inspiring. About time someone fought back. I didn't know their names, but their words landed softly, like hands steadying me from behind. Robert didn't call. Melissa did once. Her voice was thin, unsteady. She said they hadn't meant for things to go this far. I asked her how far she thought theft could go before it stopped being family business. She cried quietly and hung up. For a long time afterward, I stood by the window, not triumphant, not sorrowful, just present. Grief had lost its edges. What remained was something sharper, understanding. The next week, I returned to my law class. The instructor announced we'd be studying case precedents about property disputes. When he asked if anyone knew of a relevant example, June nudged me with a grin. I raised my hand and said, "Yes, there's one still in progress." Laughter rippled through the room, but it wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laughter that knows resilience when it hears it. At home that night, I lit a candle, poured a small glass of wine, and reread the trust one more time, not to reassure myself, but to honor the man who had believed I would one day need it. I thought of Robert and Melissa, of the lives they had built on the assumption that I would fade quietly. Perhaps, in a way, I had given them that belief through years of quiet accommodation, but those days were gone. There is a moment when a mother stops forgiving out of love, and begins forgiving out of freedom. That was where I stood now, not waiting for their repentance, but living in my own reclamation. As midnight approached, I opened the window. The city hummed softly below, cars sliding through puddles, streetlights glinting on wet pavement. I whispered into the night, not to anyone in particular. You said I had nothing left, but I still have my name. And tonight, it's louder than yours. The sound disappeared into the wind, carried somewhere beyond the river, and I realized I didn't need anyone to hear it for it to be true. The verdict came on a morning that began without ceremony, gray and damp, the kind of morning that smells of paper and waiting. I woke before dawn, dressed slowly, and sat by the window watching the city pull itself awake. Across the river, fog uncoiled from the rooftops like breath leaving a mouth. I made tea but didn't drink it. My hands were steady, my heart not racing. I wasn't nervous, not anymore. There's a point beyond fear where the body stops reacting and begins remembering what it was built for. I looked at my reflection in the glass and barely recognized the woman staring back, the set of her jaw, the calm in her eyes. She was older, yes, but her silence had changed from submission to composure. She looked like someone who had already made peace with the outcome, whatever it might be. At the courthouse, the corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and ink. Evelyn met me at the entrance, folders tucked under her arm, her posture perfectly upright despite the drizzle outside. She gave me a small nod instead of words, the way soldiers greet each other before the final battle. We walked together in silence, our shoes echoing off the marble floor, the sound both hollow and solemn. Inside the courtroom, Robert and Melissa were already seated. They didn't look up when I entered. Robert's hair had thinned at the temples, and Melissa's hands trembled slightly as she rearranged papers that didn't need rearranging. They looked less like conspirators now, and more like children who had played with something they didn't understand. I took my seat beside Evelyn, folded my hands, and waited. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and the room fell into that peculiar stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. Her voice, calm and deliberate, began with the procedural formalities. She spoke of clauses, evidence, testimonies, submissions, language designed to keep emotion at bay. But beneath it, I could hear the rhythm of reckoning, every sentence built toward something, like the slow climb of a tide that cannot be stopped once it has begun to move. I watched Robert's face as the judge read through the findings, his eyes darting from the bench to the floor, as if searching for a version of the world where this wasn't happening. Melissa's lips moved in prayer or denial. I couldn't tell which. When the judge began to read the trust itself, her tone shifted. Legal language, when spoken aloud, carries an unexpected gravity, especially when it is the voice of the state giving breath to the will of the dead. She read my husband's name first, his date of death, and then mine, Martha E. Harlow, sole trustee and executor of all properties and holdings, with full discretion and authority to manage said assets in perpetuity. I felt the words vibrate in my chest. The courtroom blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from the sudden pressure of years collapsing into a single instant. Every humiliation, every gaslighted conversation, every carefully measured kindness, they all fractured beneath the weight of my husband's handwriting and the judge's voice confirming it. Robert's lawyer objected, his tone rising, his argument a tangle of desperation disguised as civility. He claimed misunderstanding, confusion, mismanagement. Evelyn stood without haste, her calm almost cruel in contrast. She handed the judge another document, one Robert had signed transferring funds from the account he claimed wasn't mine. The judge glanced at it, then looked at him, and something in her expression hardened. The objection was dismissed. The final statement came swiftly after. The trust was valid, my authority absolute, all assets to be restored in full. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Papers shuffled. Chairs creaked. I heard none of it. All I heard was my name, repeated 3 times as the ruling was entered into record. Martha E. Harlow, trustee, executor, beneficiary. It sounded less like a judgment and more like a resurrection. Evelyn squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of solidarity, not celebration. We didn't need to speak. There is a kind of triumph that is too sacred for applause. I turned my head slightly toward Robert and Melissa. He was pale, staring at the floor. She had begun to cry silently, her mascara streaking down in slow, symmetrical lines. For a moment, I almost reached for her hand, the reflex of a mother who still wanted to comfort even the ones who had caused her pain. But I stopped. Mercy without accountability is just another form of surrender. When the gavel struck for adjournment, I rose. My knees didn't tremble this time. I walked past them without hurry, the air parting in quiet respect. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective like glass. I could see my reflection again, fragmented in puddles, an old woman in a dark coat, standing alone yet entirely intact. Evelyn joined me a few steps later, her briefcase heavy with victory. "It's done," she said simply. I nodded. "No," I said, "it's begun." We went for coffee afterward, not out of habit but ceremony. The cafe was nearly empty, the hum of the espresso machine soft and steady. She asked what I would do now that the estate was restored. I told her I hadn't decided. Freedom, after captivity, is an art that takes time to learn. She smiled at that. "Then start with what you want most," she said. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream spiral into brown, and realized I wanted silence. Not the silence they had imposed, but the kind I could claim. That evening, I returned to the apartment and took out the trust one last time. I laid it on the table, unfolded it completely, and smoothed the creases. The ink had faded slightly in places, but my husband's signature remained bold, defiant against time. I read the document from beginning to end, not for the law, but for the love hidden between the lines. He had written this years before his heart failed, long before the children learned to measure affection in assets. He must have known that one day I would need his faith as proof of my own. The thought made my throat tighten, but the tears didn't fall. They no longer needed to. I spent the next few days in quiet administrative storms, meetings with bankers, estate agents, endless forms to transfer everything back to my name. Each signature I placed was another small reclamation. One banker, a young man with a nervous smile, asked if I wanted my son added as co-signer for convenience. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Convenience is how women disappear." He flushed and nodded quickly, typing without looking up. Again. When all the accounts were finally restored, I asked the financial officer to print the final confirmation page. My name was listed at the top, centered and unshared. I folded it and slipped it into my wallet beside my driver's license, not as proof for others, but as a reminder to myself. That night, I slept without dreams. The air in the apartment was cool and still, the kind of stillness that feels earned. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was from Robert. The handwriting was strained, the lines uneven. He didn't apologize directly. Men rarely do. But he wrote that he hoped we could find a way to heal as a family. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer with other relics of former illusions. Healing, I realized, doesn't always mean return. Sometimes it means acceptance of distance. He needed forgiveness to ease his conscience. I needed it to free myself. They are not the same thing. The final act came almost by accident. Evelyn called to inform me that with my restored authority, I had the right to amend the trust. "You can make it your own now," she said. That evening, I sat at the table with a pen and a new sheet of paper. My handwriting was slower now, but still clear. I added a single paragraph. "Upon my death, the primary assets of this estate shall be transferred to a foundation supporting elderly women facing coercion, displacement, or legal exploitation. This trust, once built on love and protection, shall continue as a safeguard for those who have been silenced." I signed it with steady hands. The ink bled slightly into the fibers of the page, like veins finding their way home. When it was done, I felt a calm so profound it bordered on disbelief. I had turned inheritance into legacy, pain into protection. The circle had closed. Outside, the rain began again, softer this time, like a benediction. I opened the window, letting the cool air in, and listened to the sound of it striking the sill. For the first time in years, the world felt proportional to my body. Not too big, not too small, just enough. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down, and looked around the room. Every object had meaning now because I had chosen it, because no one else had placed it there for me. The city lights flickered through the curtains, casting gentle patterns across the floor. I thought of all the women still sitting in rooms like mine, waiting for someone to believe them. I whispered to them in my mind, "You are not the remainder of your life. You are its proof." And so the climax was not thunder, nor confrontation, nor tears. It was the quiet signing of a name, the same name they had tried to erase, written again in my own hand, under my own will, preserved for others to read long after I'm gone. It was the sound of the pen gliding over paper, soft but final, the sound of a woman reclaiming not just her property, but the authorship of her own story. The weeks after the verdict unfolded with an unfamiliar gentleness, a slowness I had almost forgotten the body was capable of. The world seemed to move at a distance, like a film slightly out of sync with its own sound. For the first time in years, no one was asking me for signatures, explanations, or apologies. The phone was quiet. The silence that had once felt suffocating now stretched like clean linen across my days. I filled the hours not with waiting, but with motion, small, deliberate movements that reintroduced me to myself. I rearranged the furniture, not out of restlessness, but curiosity, as if I wanted to learn how space could breathe differently. I began cooking again, recipes I hadn't touched since my husband was alive. The scent of onions and thyme filled the apartment, and I caught myself humming. It startled me. It had been so long since sound came from joy rather than defiance. Letters began to arrive from strangers. Some had read about the case in the local paper. Others had heard about it through friends or church bulletins. Women, mostly, widows, retirees, teachers, caretakers, wrote to say they felt seen, that they'd been dismissed by their families too, that they'd begun to wonder if invisibility was simply the tax of aging. Their words were heavy and tender all at once. I read each letter slowly, some twice, and replied to as many as I could. I didn't offer advice. I had none to give. I only wrote that dignity was not something to be granted back to us. It was something that could never truly be taken. I invited a few of them to meet on Thursdays at the community center, and by the end of the month, there were 8 of us sitting around a long wooden table, drinking weak coffee and learning each other's stories. We called it, half in jest, the Trust Circle. It wasn't a formal group, just a gathering of women who had decided they would no longer be politely erased. June was the first to say it out loud. "You realize, Martha, you've become a symbol." I laughed then, almost embarrassed. Symbols are for marble plaques, and I was still a woman who occasionally forgot where she'd put her keys. But she was right in one sense. My story had outgrown me. It had become something others used to explain their own anger, their own grief. That realization didn't inflate me, it steadied me. I understood now that survival wasn't meant to end in solitude. It had to ripple outward, even quietly, or else it would fossilize into bitterness. One morning, I walked to the courthouse alone, not for business, just to see it one more time. The corridors were empty, the echo of footsteps hollow. I stood outside the same courtroom where the judge had spoken my name into permanence. The door was closed, but I could still feel the gravity of that space. I touched the handle briefly, as one might touch a gravestone, not to mourn, but to acknowledge. Then I turned away, descending the wide staircase slowly, the weight of memory evenly distributed between my feet. Outside, the sky was pale and clean, a thin line of sunlight cutting through the clouds. For the first time since the ordeal began, I allowed myself to think of Robert without resentment. I thought of the boy he once was, the one who used to bring me wilted dandelions and say, "For you, Mama, because you like things that keep trying." I hoped he remembered that version of himself someday. Melissa, too. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because forgetting kindness is its own kind of death. In the spring, I sold the large property my husband and I had once owned, the one they had tried to seize from me. I didn't visit it again. Instead, I signed the papers in Evelyn's office and donated half of the proceeds to establish a fund under my new foundation's name. We called it the Harlow Trust for Women in Transition. Evelyn helped with the paperwork, insisting on making it legally bulletproof. When the final document was signed, she looked at me and said, "You've done something rare, Martha. You've turned survival into structure." I smiled and told her that the best revenge against erasure is continuity. The foundation began small. A few scholarships, a partnership with a shelter, legal workshops for older women who didn't know how to read the fine print on what their children asked them to sign. But word spread. The same newspaper that had once written a short piece about my trial now published an article titled, "A Widow's Victory Becomes a Lifeline for Others." They sent a photographer who asked me to sit by the window, holding the original trust document. I agreed only if they promised to focus not on the money, but on the principle. The young journalist nodded earnestly, though I knew the headline would decide for itself. When the article came out, I was surprised to find it respectful. They quoted one line I'd said without thinking. They said I had nothing left, but I still had my name, and sometimes that's the beginning of everything. By summer, the circle of women at the community center had doubled. Some brought daughters, others brought friends. We began ending each meeting with a small ritual. We would write one thing we reclaimed that week, time, space, voice, and drop it into a jar we called the Ledger of Return. It was our quiet rebellion against the myth of decline. Watching those slips of paper accumulate felt more satisfying than any legal victory. Each one was evidence of continuity, of women refusing to vanish politely. In quieter moments, when the apartment was bathed in late afternoon light, I found myself talking to my husband again. Not aloud, but in thought, the kind of conversation that requires no sound. I told him I had kept his promise, that his foresight had carried me when my own strength faltered. I told him the sea was still on my list, that one day I would go and sit beside it again, not to grieve, but to watch the water's indifference to everything we call loss. I imagined him smiling the way he used to when he didn't need to answer, because he knew I already understood. Toward the end of that year, Emily came to visit. She was taller now, quieter, with that self-conscious grace teenagers wear when they are halfway between child and adult. She hugged me for a long time, and when she finally pulled back, she said, "Dad told me what happened. He said you were right." The words hit me harder than any verdict, not because I needed vindication, but because truth had found its way back into the family, however faintly. We spent the afternoon baking, badly, laughing often, and she told me she wanted to study law. "I think it's brave to make things official," she said. I smiled and told her bravery is often just persistence disguised as paperwork. When she left, she turned at the door and said, "You know, Grandma, everyone says you changed everything." I told her I hadn't changed everything. I had only remembered that I existed. The night after her visit, I sat on the balcony with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The city was quiet, except for the occasional hum of traffic. I thought about all the women still standing on thresholds, waiting to be heard. I wished I could tell each one that the world does not end when they stop asking permission. I wished I could tell them that starting over at 79 is not defiance, it's testimony. The wind carried the faint smell of the river, and I closed my eyes. I wasn't lonely. I was finally alone on my own terms. Before going to bed, I wrote one last note in my journal, not as a record, but as a message for whoever might find it after I'm gone. There will always be people who mistake silence for surrender and age for absence. Let them. The world is built on their mistakes. The rest of us will keep signing our names until the ink runs out. Then I turned off the light, the soft hum of the city drifting through the window, and felt a peace so complete it almost frightened me. It wasn't triumph or pride, it was recognition. I had walked through invisibility and come out visible to myself. That is all the justice I ever needed.